Good evening, everyone. My name is Jenny Kraska. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Catholic Conference, and welcome to our webinar this evening on question 1, which will be on Maryland's ballot this November, the Right to Reproductive Freedom Amendment. Before we get started this evening and I introduce our distinguished panelists, I thought we could begin with a prayer and a Hail Mary. So please join me in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Again, thank you all for being with us this evening. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I'm going to go ahead and get started by introducing our two panelists, and then we will begin with questions. There will be a time at the end after we're done with questions for both panelists. We do have many questions that have come in over the last few days, so we will be asking some questions from you, our viewers, as well. So again, we have with us Elizabeth Kirk and Erika Bachiochi. Elizabeth Kirk is the co-director of the Center for Law and the Human Person and assistant professor of law at the Columbus School of Law. She holds an undergraduate degree in English literature from the University of Missouri, a law degree from the University of Notre Dame, and has done graduate studies in theology. She has considerable experience in matters pertaining to the family in law and policy, and is a frequent speaker, media expert, and writer on these matters. She is an associate scholar for the Charlotte Lozier Institute, serving as legal policy expert with a special interest in adoption law and policy. Elizabeth, thank you for being with us this evening. Erika Bachiochi is a fellow with the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Erika is a legal scholar who works at the intersection of constitutional law, political theory, women's history, and Catholic social teaching. A 2018 visiting scholar at Harvard Law School, she is a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her latest book, The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, was published by Notre Dame University Press in 2021. Erika holds an undergraduate degree in political science and government from Middlebury College, a Master of Arts degree in theology from Boston College, and a law degree from Boston University School of Law. So as you can see this evening, we have some wonderful panelists to discuss this very important topic of question 1 that will be on the Maryland ballot this November. So I'm going to jump in right away, and we're going to get started with Elizabeth. And just for our viewers to know, we're going to have a screen up that has the actual text of the ballot initiative, so folks can read and see what that says and refer to that as we begin this conversation. Elizabeth, I'm going to go ahead and get started just with some very basics here. Tell us, what is question 1 and what would it do?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you have the text there. So question 1 is a constitutional amendment. So it would amend the Maryland state constitution, and it would insert into the Constitution a fundamental right to reproductive freedom. I'm sure we'll unpack the various parts of it, but it would enshrine that fundamental freedom without really any meaningful legal limits. So Maryland, of course, unfortunately, already protects abortion to the fullest extent, but this amendment would enshrine it in the state constitution permanently. As well as usher in a whole new set of protections for whatever else might be meant by the term reproductive freedom.
Wonderful, thank you, I appreciate that. So most of the people watching, I'm sure, are not lawyers. They don't have the in-depth knowledge of how the legislative process works. Could you provide an explanation for us of the difference between a constitutional amendment like question 1 is, and maybe a statute or a law that a legislature would pass?
Sure. Well, a statute or a law that would be passed by the legislature, those are things that are debated by legislators. They are often, the product of a lot of compromise or collaboration. They're often very topical. They often relate to like a particular need of the community or respond to certain circumstances. And once they're passed, they can be relatively easily amended. So if the facts or circumstances that gave rise to it change, future legislatures can amend or even repeal the law. Another, recourse that the people have if they don't like a particular law is that they can, the electoral process, right, allows people to remove their elected representatives and put instead in office representatives who can craft laws that better respond to the needs of the people, et cetera. So statutes are embodiments of policy preferences, but they're also ones that can be fairly responsive to the needs of the people. In contrast, a constitution is really meant to be, or is, the government's fundamental law, right? It often primarily deals with foundational governmental principles, like how various parts of the government, the executive branch, the legislative branch, how they deal with one another. It doesn't tend to get into the sort of very particular or topical circumstances that statutes would. And the text of the Constitution, including any amendments like the one that we're talking about tonight, that trumps all existing statutes or laws or any future laws, right? It's the supreme law of the polity. And constitutions and amendments they're not easy to enact, right? We're going through this whole process. It first had to go through the legislature, now it's going to the people, and they're rarely repealed. Because you need another amendment to repeal it. So the whole process that we're going through would be necessary to undo it. So they tend to be much more significant and serious than statutes or laws in terms of their permanence.
So, so what you're saying basically is that this is almost virtually a permanent fixture that we're putting into our state constitution if it were to pass.
Again, I mean, it's possible, right? I mean, the prohibition was unwound by a constitutional amendment, but it's a unique circumstance and unlikely, right? It's very difficult once something is enshrined in the Constitution to repeal it.
Thank you. I want to get into a little bit of some of the technical language of this amendment. Again, for those of us who may be watching who are not attorneys, some of this may be a little bit confusing language. And so I want to unpack a little bit of it. There's this phrase that says compelling state interest achieved by the least restrictive means. Again, I think that's for lawyers who are watching, it's, constitutional law will come back to us very quickly. But for those of us who aren't, could you talk a little bit about what that means in layman's terms, if you could?
Yeah, I mean, even those of us who are lawyers, don't necessarily retain all of these the legalese of constitutional law. So that last clause there that you've identified, that the state can't deny, burden, or abridge the fundamental right to reproductive freedom unless these conditions, a compelling state interest achieved by the least restrictive means. That's a known legal test. It's called the strict scrutiny standard. What does that mean? So again, legislatures enact laws all the time, right? And the vast majority of those laws are ordinary. As I said, they deal with ordinary topics, and they're within the legislature's power to pass. And so if one of those laws gets challenged and the court has to review it, the court will give the legislature a great deal of deference and just say, they'll just look at the law and see whether it's reasonable. So that's known as the rational basis test. And that's what most laws get if they get challenged in court. But if a law happens to infringe on a fundamental right, as we see, being created in this amendment, then the legislature, when a law is challenged, doesn't get that benefit of the doubt, that deference that I spoke about. Instead of just asking, is this a reasonable law? The court will apply this very strict standard known as strict scrutiny. And it's so strict that the lingo that, we learn in law school is strict in theory, fatal in fact. So laws that are evaluated or assessed under this strict scrutiny standard almost always fail. So that's the meaning of the test. So what that means is any existing laws that regulate abortion or anything that's encompassed by the term reproductive freedom will be given this very, very close look with little or no deference to the legislature. And it's unlikely that most laws survive that kind of scrutiny.
Great. Thank you for that. That was very helpful. I want to go back a little bit. You know, we talked about the difference between a constitutional amendment and a statute. If a constitutional amendment such as this one, such as question 1, were to pass, how does it harm the ability or maybe hinder the ability of a state legislature to be flexible when it comes to dealing with issues like abortion, women's health care, whatever may be meant under this broad term of reproductive freedom?
Yeah, that's a great question. So because a constitution, as we said, trumps state laws, and that means that the legislature will not be able to pass any future laws that touch on reproductive freedom without meeting this very, very high standard. And so the practical reality is that this will have a chilling effect on the legislature's future ability to craft laws that would respond. Right now, the policy preferences of the state of Maryland with respect to abortion are very protective of abortion. But over time, if facts and circumstances change with respect to the people of Maryland's views on things like late-term abortion or health and safety standards for women, or a whole host of quite moderate restrictions on abortion, could come up and could gain, purchase in the legislature, and they would, however, they would have this very rigorous, onerous standard hanging over their heads, and that would have a chilling effect on their probably their willingness or their ability to craft laws, because if they passed one, it is likely to immediately be subject to challenge and extensive, expensive litigation, right? So again, the amendment, I would say, would have these sort of twofold consequences. One, any existing laws would be subject to this scrutiny, and it would have the chilling effect on any future laws.
So again, that goes, I think your example was a great one. Maryland, as we've already stated, is probably, one of a handful of the most permissive states when it comes to what's allowable in terms of abortion. And so if in the future things changed legislatively in Maryland, and the Maryland legislature wanted to pass a ban on late-term abortion because now abortion is legal through all 9 months of pregnancy in Maryland, most likely they would not be able to do that because that law would not meet this strict scrutiny standard.
Even if they did it, it would immediately be challenged, and it would likely be struck down under the very strict standard of the strict scrutiny standard in this amendment.
Wow. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously a lot to think about when it comes to what we're doing with this amendment.
Yeah, and if I can just add very quickly, I mean, this is not just sort of my viewpoint. If this is a little bit of abortion jurisprudence history, but Roe adopted the same standard, and you can just look at all the cases in the years after Roe, and the case after case struck down the laws at issue, and many of them were pretty moderate restrictions, including things like health and safety standards for women. And so when the court in the 90s decided Casey, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where they affirmed the right to abortion, so it wasn't as if they were backing down on that, but they did say the strict scrutiny standard is too strict. And it, in fact, strikes down all kinds of laws that don't have any meaningful impact on a woman's choice. And so they used a lower standard called the undue burden standard. Anyway, that's a different topic. But I mean, my point is that this is not just my view. You can look at a whole, line of precedent of strict scrutiny cases where laws just get struck down.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just to sort of wrap up, and then we'll go on to Erika. One last question I have for you. Obviously, none of us can predict the future, but could you make an educated assessment of what the scope of the impact of this amendment would be in Maryland if it were to pass in November?
Yeah, well, I think vulnerable are the kinds of things we already talked about, right? The impact on any existing laws, meager as they may be, that touch on abortion. The fact that it will have this chilling effect on future laws, as I said. Also, if you look at that language of the amendment, there's a few phrases in there that are very open, and so it's not really in terms of scope of impact, right? I mean, I think we've talked about the scope of impact on existing abortion laws or future abortion laws, but it protects an individual's fundamental right. The word individual is not defined, so a question arises the extent to which it would grant minors the fundamental rights described therein. Again, you have very, very modest laws with respect to parental involvement, but you do have some. And so it raises the question whether those kinds of restrictions would be permissible. A second thing is, just as we've talked about, that it protects reproductive freedom, right? So that includes, as the text says, abortion, but that could be interpreted to mean a whole host of other things that may now, be, protected, paid for at taxpayer expense, et cetera. So whatever's encompassed by reproductive freedom. And then, as I said, because of this strict scrutiny standard, there's no effective limits on whatever this extraordinarily sweeping freedom is. So other rights, right, like religious freedom rights or parental rights or conscience rights of healthcare providers, those are all going to butt up, right, against this newly declared fundamental reproductive freedom right. And they're, who knows how that will shake out, but they will certainly be vulnerable to the extent that they infringe on reproductive freedom. So I think at a minimum, what you're going to see, what the state of Maryland is going to see, is extensive, expensive litigation to sort of sort out what the scope of this, what this amendment is.
Right. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. We're going to back out and take a bigger view of this issue a little bit. Obviously, as we all know, we did not get here overnight, but there's a long history of reproductive freedom, women's rights, all of these issues that have come up over time that have gotten us to the moment that we are in right now, not only in Maryland, but in the United States as a whole. And I wanted to bring Erika into the conversation and talk a little bit about, these terms, Erika, if you wouldn't mind discussing with us maybe and explaining a little bit about the history of what we mean by reproductive health care in the context of women's rights. I know that, books, including your own, have been written about these types of issues, so it could be a very long conversation, but if you could give us maybe a little bit of a history lesson on, how it is that we got to where we're at and having this conversation around what, we term reproductive health care, reproductive freedom.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think I should limit it to the question of abortion with regard to reproductive health care and just how much that term and how we've thought about that with regard to women and women's rights has changed over the course of the last, century and a half. I mean, what's fascinating to me, and as I listen to the debates around this and engage in the debates around this, is how really deeply, deeply antithetical this understanding of, reproductive freedom, reproductive health care, reproductive rights is to the way our country's first female doctors, the first women in our country who, were physicians, as well as the first women's rights advocates, and how they all talked about abortion. And there was it was a commonplace that abortion was, in their view, the unjust taking of innocent developing life. And you have to remember, in terms of the history lesson, that this was in the mid to late 19th century. This is when they're demanding access to education, to contract and property rights. And it's exactly around the time that the nation as a whole is, both fighting the Civil War and then within, the Reconstruction period and the 14th Amendment and its ratification in 1868 in language like life and liberty and equal protection of laws and all that kind of stuff is then, inserted into the Constitution. And everyone at that time understood that abortion was the unjust taking of human life, of developing a developing child. Now, like the pro-life doctors today who are trying to make arguments, even though the press tends to shut them down, the country's first female doctors recognized their responsibility to care for two patients, mother and child, and that care sometimes meant, especially with, less sort of developed healthcare that we have today, it sometimes meant that there would be a devastating loss of a child in the effort to provide care to the mother. But there was always an understanding that there were two patients there, both mother and child. And if you look back, there's actually a fascinating book that I would recommend to those interested, especially in those first female doctors. It's really incredible work that's unique that I've never seen before. It's a book called Pity for Evil, but I could bring so many different of these female doctors to bear sort of on this question, including someone like Elizabeth Blackwell, who we all learn is the first woman to practice medicine, who called abortion and the abortionists, some of who are gaining, great kind of infamy and making lots of money off abortion. She called it a degradation of medicine, which was very upsetting to her and other female doctors because they really saw medicine as this kind of noble profession for women. But I just want to quote only one. Again, I love quoting these women because I think that they have a lot to teach us. But there's one particular woman, Dr. Alice Stockham, who is an OBGYN. She was the fifth female who is licensed to practice medicine. And she, in her book was kind of a book written for lay women to educate them about the female body, the physiology of the female body, fetal development, pregnancy, childbirth, and all that. And I'm going to read to you this is sort of quite representative of the view of all of these early women, again, who are at this time when they're sort of, getting into the medical profession and other professions as well. So she says, by what false reasoning does a woman convince herself that another life, still more dependent upon her for its existence with equal rights and possibilities, has no claim upon her for protection? And what's fascinating about these women is that they believed as more and more women got into the profession of medicine, that they would actually see far less abortion because they believed that women would be particularly attuned to helping women and sort of pay attention to the needs that a pregnant woman had and in all of sort of reproductive health.
That's fascinating. Would you mind repeating what the name of that book was that you recommended?
So Pity for Evil is the book that just came out last year out of Encounter Books by Monica Clem and Madeline McDowell, who's a Notre Dame educated historian. It's an excellent book, and I would highly recommend it to those interested in this question and because I think that we have a lot to learn from these women who saw their equal rights and the child's equal rights as one of a piece. And they also saw that these two things shouldn't be in conflict with one another. And they saw lots of potential repercussions should we see these in conflict, which I think are coming to pass in our culture today.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. You touched on this a little bit in your answer to the previous question, but could you elaborate a little bit on the parallels that exist between the early feminist movement, especially with some of these first female doctors, stance on abortion, and today's pro-life movement, particularly in addressing the root causes of poverty and inequality?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is important to see is how they would have seen it just in terms of how they understood their rights. Rights and responsibilities are always correlative. Like they always are intimately interconnected. So we kind of think of rights as protections for autonomy when they understood that rights were for their responsibilities, to carry out their responsibilities. So I think that you very much see that's how the pro-life movement thinks about, sort of how to respond to those who are in the situation of a crisis pregnancy. That what do we do when there's, someone feels desperate enough to seek out an abortion? That for pro-lifers, both then and now, that's indicative of kind of a failure of society to be truly hospitable to women, who are those, of course, with a capacity for pregnancy and childbearing. And so what these women did, and it's fascinating if you read more about them and get into the sort of literature, because they really are, those of us who've been involved in the pro-life movement, and really those who have been far more than I in kind of the grassroots of really caring for women and children and their children, is that they wanted to seek to reduce the number of women seeking abortions by basically, not only educating on fetal development and the nature of abortion, which I mentioned, Dr. Stockham did, but lots of women did. They would go around and have women only audiences and do that. But they also worked very, very urgently sometimes just among women doctors, but then also women's rights advocates and other women who weren't involved in women's rights advocacy at all, and then other men as well. But they founded, they wanted improvements in maternal and fetal health, and they thought that that would be that if they founded female staffed hospitals for women, and if they sort of raised funds for the creation of maternity homes, where vulnerable mothers who were, say, abandoned or impoverished or fleeing abuse, where they would be supported to raise their own children, or, you know, be able to kind of have the courage to offer their own children for adoption. And this was something that I think, I mean, we've seen carried on, despite, you know, the law that has allowed for an abortion license for so long, that we've seen, you know, carried on in communities to this day.
Thank you for that. Could you talk a little bit about the impact that abortion, you know, we've been talking about this and sort of where it's stemmed from in, you know, abortion and early pro-life, early female doctors and the connection between the pro-life movement, but specifically on the issue of abortion, what is the impact that abortion has on some of the most vulnerable populations, including low income women of color, and how can some of the social justice efforts, especially social justice efforts of the church in particular, prioritize protecting women?
Yeah, so I mean, most people watching probably have seen the, you know, data that shows that the vast number of women who end their pregnancies in our country are poor or very poor, but they also tend to be unmarried. And so, you know, hopefully people have also seen, you know, sort of the, I think, awful news that it's not uncommon for women who, you know, is a low wage worker to need to return to work just days after having given birth, sometimes within 2 weeks. And so it's all to say that, you know, lots has changed since the mid 19th century when those women were, you know, making these kinds of arguments. But women still kind of, you know, can conceive children in pretty precarious circumstances today, with whether it's terrible workplace accommodations or, you know, really subpar healthcare. And that's very true, especially among minority women. And so these are absolutely social justice issues we should all be prioritizing. And I think that that's a good way to think about it, is that it's not only, you know, the injustice done to the child in an abortion, but it is also the injustice that we don't have the kind of, you know, healthcare system, especially for the poor, that offers the kind of, you know, reproductive health care that they need, that we sort of tend to push them toward abortion, like, you can't handle this, you know. But there's another social justice issue that I think is really important that sometimes we don't want to talk about, but that I think is urgent that we talk about. And it's, you know, the fact of falling marriage rates and the lack of paternal responsibility. And that to me is an urgent social justice issue, because I think what we've seen is when you decouple sex from childbearing and you decouple childbearing from marriage, as we have for basically a half century through very liberal abortion laws, it basically lets the children's fathers off the hook, which isn't good for the children's fathers either. And this is something that, again, was like a commonplace for a long, long time that we've sort of forgotten about, even though we see the kind of tragedy all around us. So, I mean, even Alan Guttmacher, who is the second president of Planned Parenthood, said that, quote, abortion on demand relieves the husband, you could say the man now, of all possible responsibility. And so I think like that kind of abdication of paternal duties, of expectations around father sticking around, the flight from marriage has really worsened the conditions for motherhood in our country. So it is, you know, workplace accommodations, it is subpar healthcare, but it's also the fact that we don't see sex as serious business, and we don't expect men to be around. So when I hear reproductive freedom, what I hear is, you know, women left alone with the responsibility of pregnancy while the men remain free to just walk away. And so we can try to, you know, have abortion to imitate that freedom that men have to walk away, but it's always the woman who has to, you know, a man just sort of walks away and, you know, maybe there's no consequences to him, although there probably are. But it's the woman who has to then go in and affirmatively go in and take the life of her own child. And so there's no equality there. And so it's, to me, like the real social justice behind that is like, you know, asking men to man up and expect more from men. And I think it's up to us women to do that.
Well said. Thank you for that. One final question for you, Erika. You've done a lot of research on the correlation of abortion and family life. And so talk a little bit more, and you touched on this briefly. You were starting to get into this at the end of your last question. How does unrestricted access to abortion like that of what we see here in Maryland and other states around the country affect the cultural attitudes towards motherhood, family life, and the role generally of women in society?
Yeah, I mean, we keep hearing about how young women are afraid of pregnancy and the prospect of raising children, don't want to have children. And I just sort of am not surprised by this because of how much, the kind of callousness we have toward children, it starting in the womb, has impacted like how we think about motherhood. It's also true, and you can, just go look it up, that pregnancy discrimination is incredibly high in the workplace, despite having, 50 to 60 years of, what we've been calling feminism. So it seems to me that it's very clear when you think about it, that if you belittle the moral status of the unborn child, which is what we do by saying that, a mother has a kind of license to end the life of that child for whatever reason she wants at any time, that you're belittling the state of pregnancy, you're belittling every expectant mother, because the value of what she is doing, like the value of the labor she is undertaking, and it's a serious labor being pregnant and having children, that it depends upon the intrinsic value of the dependent human child in her care. And when we just sort of push it off, like not wanting to talk about what it is that happens, it's just a choice, that it just, ends up that pregnancy in our culture gets compared with any other lifestyle choice or medical condition, or worse, it becomes kind of this disability or obstacle or opportunity cost in kind of the rat race of modern economic life. And I think what we've done to ourselves is kind of put blinders on by saying like abortion is freedom and just repeating this as loud as we can. This message has like kicked into high gear, of course, since the overturning of Roe. The fact remains that sexual intercourse still impacts women more than men. But the problem is now that this like distinctive privilege of being a mother is increasingly kind of illegible to our culture. We don't hear about it as much. We don't want to, to really honor it. And then the distinctive burdens of, pregnancy and of being a mother, where they're not more easily born than they were any other time, in a lot of ways, especially without fathers around. So the irony is that the modern abortion rights, kind of this feminism that we see in, especially blue states, which claim to be so feminist, it's elevated kind of traditionally male norms, concerning sex, parenting, and work, rather than doing what I think those first early women's rights advocates, our first women doctors, what they were trying to do was create a society that was actually hospitable to women in the fullness of their dignity. And it's so tragic to me that we have such a hard time talking about this issue, that we just shut down debate, that we can just use terms like reproductive freedom or, equality or any of these words and think that like just answers the question, rather than like getting down to what's happened, what we're doing to ourselves, to our children especially, but then also to, family life as a whole. And this impacts everyone because we're all from families and we're all impacted by others' families.
Thank you for that. Elizabeth, Erika, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I think I could keep the discussion going for a lot longer, but I want to be respectful of folks' time, and there are a lot of questions that we've been getting. So I'm going to jump into, if you two don't mind, some of the questions, and I'm going to try and, we've gotten a lot of similar questions, so I'm going to try and combine them, folks who are listening online. Elizabeth, first for you, we've gotten a lot of questions about, you talked about, and we all have this evening, talked about the permissiveness of Maryland and how it just seems like anything goes, especially when it comes to abortion. So what do you think motivates the groups that are advocating for this, that want to see this pass? Why? I mean, if abortion is legal through all 9 months of pregnancy, the state is paying for a lot of it, lots of different things that we could talk about in terms of abortion here in Maryland and how permissive it is. Why do the groups who are behind advocating for this, why do they want to see this pass?
I don't know what they're thinking, right? Why I couldn't say with certainty, but I think one thing that Dobbs did, right, in reversing Roe, was to return the question of abortion to the people and to the legislative process. And so I think for those who don't trust the people, right, to grapple with and to work through this issue, and enshrining abortion in the Constitution is safer and more protective of abortion access than mere statutes, even those like Maryland's that are robustly protective of abortion. So it's not surprising that they want to remove even the possibility of some restriction or regulation of abortion and enshrine it in the Constitution.
Thank you for that. Erika, we've been getting a lot of questions this evening about people are fascinated to learn about these early female doctors, really hoping and advocating for the fact that if more female doctors came on the scene, that there would be less abortion potentially. Folks are, where did we go wrong? Why didn't that happen? Is there any one thing or a couple series of events that you could point to or that you would point to as to why that didn't end up happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. That's sort of a question of intellectual history that's hard and complex because there's so many sort of interacting conditions and circumstances and all that. I mean, I think, there is sort of, there are some like kind of on the far right these days who will say it's, because women got rights and that's where it all went wrong. And my view of this is that right around the time that women were sort of, achieving these basic rights that we would think of as like, say, anti-discrimination law, but access to education and those kinds of things. At the very same time, there was an incredibly different understanding of education. And that education was progressive education. It was like technocratic education. It was education for skills for the increasingly, though not yet, global economy. And so we lost what the kind of education that those early women wanted, which was liberal education. And it's the education that enables one to really think about what it is to be a human being, to think about sort of the big questions of life, to think about our duties and responsibilities to one another, to think about who I am in the universe, and just even to ponder those questions instead of just assuming they've been, all dealt with by science, and now we can go on and just, be happy we can buy a lot of things with whatever money we make in our jobs. And I think like that kind of rupture happened around the same time. And so when we, fail to sort of fail to be sort of grateful for basically the Judeo-Christian inheritance we have that, understands each individual human person is made in the image and likeness of God, and the great dignity and nobility, and how much we have to care and preserve each and every life that we can, and that we have duties, especially those of us who are strong have duties to the vulnerable. Like this was all part and parcel of the great tradition that our country was built in, and so it seems to me like when there's a flight away from that with secularization, with people being much more interested in kind of careerism and work than the responsibility of passing things on to the next generation and doing the hard work of becoming an adult and having children, then it, I think the whole sort of value system changes. And so then when whoever's entering into medicine, especially medicine, right, where like care for the person is so crucial and so central to what they're doing, especially for the vulnerable, then it loses its meaning. And that's where kind of degradation of medicine starts to come in. And, I think it's a real shame. I have a daughter who's applying to med school right now. And I think it is a beautiful profession for women. And the sad thing is, at least around where I live, that most OBs, it's hard to be a pro-life person and even get into the profession now. So, it's only going to be when women start to come around to see these truths about what's happened to our country, I think that we'll be able to sort of change course.
Thank you for that. And it kind of, this actually goes really nicely into a question, Elizabeth, I think for you. You touched a little bit on in one of your answers about the intersection of all these different rights that are going to, you know, sort of be butting up against one another if this were to pass. And we've been getting a lot of questions about what this would mean for conscience protections in Maryland, especially for medical professionals, and whether you think that what that effect may be on those conscience protections that we may have in law right now in Maryland, and whether or not you believe that it will affect the type of providers that may come or may choose to practice or not practice in Maryland because of this.
Yeah, I think clearly it will. I mean, I think just as I spoke about the chilling effect on the legislators, right, who might wish to propose even kind of moderate laws, or that Erika spoke about her daughter and the hostile, you know, tenor of the medical profession to life. I think that it is very challenging for doctors who want to, pro-life doctors. But as I said, I think, you know, it's uncertain what the clash of these rights will look like. You know, what we know from prior jurisprudence is that, you know, take, for example, the clash between the right to abortion and parental rights, right? They both were, before Dobbs, constitutionally protected rights, and where they butted up against one another, parental rights, you know, suffered, right? Because what the court said is that minors have a right to abortion, parents have a right to be involved, but that can't trump the woman's access to abortion. And so, I mean, I'm summarizing a lot of complicated law here, but the point is that one of the rights will have to suffer. And when you have a right that's categorized as a fundamental right with strict scrutiny, that's the highest protection really that the law can give. And so any right, whether it's religious freedom, parental rights, or what have you, I think is very vulnerable to being restricted in the face of this particular right.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to stay with you, Elizabeth, just for a minute and ask if you, and this may be out of your depth and you may not know, but I'm going to ask anyways, because we've gotten several questions about the fact that we're not the first state that is going to be dealing with a constitutional amendment of this type. Since the overturning of Roe with the Dobbs decision, we've seen states like Michigan and Ohio and California pass some form of a constitutional amendment that enshrines abortion into their state constitutions as well. Are you aware, can you talk to what the result of that has been practically on the ground in any of those states, or anything that you may even you know, be aware of that is happening or percolating up as a result of those amendments?
So the state that I'm most familiar with, which is a bit different posture, but it's the kind of same outcome, is Kansas. So they didn't pass a constitutional amendment like this, but their state Supreme Court found a right to abortion in the state constitution. And then there was this constitutional effort to undo that, and that effort failed. So the end result is the same, which is that there is a robust constitutional right to abortion in the state constitution with strict scrutiny as the standard. And what happened? Well, already, even though leading up to the ballot initiative, you know, the other side said, oh, no, we're not going to challenge any existing laws. And Kansas did have some moderate restrictions on the books. Well, we've already seen, you know, the lawsuits strike, you know, and predictably, the court striking down the laws that have come before it. Even laws like the state's informed consent statute that would merely, of course, Maryland, I don't think has an informed consent statute, but Kansas had a pretty modest one that simply said, you know, if you are seeking an abortion, here's your alternatives, here's the risks of the procedure, here's places you can call if you want, you know, fetal or maternal resources. That law was struck down. That law had no impact on the woman's actual choice, right? But it was just giving her information to make an informed choice, and that was struck down. So that's one thing, is that predictably the laws will be challenged and be struck down. The second piece is that abortions will skyrocket. And so what we saw in Kansas was before the Supreme Court decision, there were about 7,000 abortions each year in the state of Kansas. Now that number is expected to be 20,000 this year. That's just within the scope of a few years. And it's now, like Maryland, is a kind of destination state, right, especially for late-term abortions for people from other states. So that's the thing we see. We see laws struck down, and we see abortion as a practice and as an industry sort of skyrocket.
Thank you for that. Erika, what are some concrete ways that individuals and families can offer meaningful support to women in their local communities that may be experiencing, unexpected pregnancies, particularly those who feel isolated or unsupported?
I mean, this is the big question and the big, I think, obligation of those of us who, are incredibly frustrated by, what Elizabeth has just reported and what we see in the news all the time is that, the work of, this is a Catholic, webinar here. So I'm just going to speak to the Christian commission that we have, which is to care for the vulnerable. And that does include vulnerable children in the womb. It also includes their moms and families who are vulnerable. And I think it's something that is hard to find sort of a place for in modern life. Sometimes we think that other people are doing that, hospitals are doing it and all of that. But I think those who do that work within their local communities, to me, deserve like the biggest prize. It's actually, the book I mentioned before, Pity for Evil. It's who those authors dedicate their book to, because they see that work as being the continuation of the kind of work that those early women knew would be necessary to help women have kind of the confidence to make decisions about, when they've had a child, do they care for their own child, especially if there's not a dad around, or do they offer that child for adoption? So, I mean, to me, that one-on-one work is so important. I give a lot of praise to those who are doing it, especially in the time like ours where, I live in Massachusetts. So it seems to me that, it's kind of this incredible reversal where the types of people who have invested like decades of their lives caring for women in a one-on-one way are now being sort of, accused of being kind of criminal and pulling the wool over their eyes, or all sorts of different things that the Attorney General in this state is claiming. And it's just, it's like black is white and white is black. I mean, it's a very confusing time to live in. And as a Catholic, I mean, I feel like I end every podcast, every talk I give with like, we have to be praying more. We have to be, really on our knees more, offering more sacrifice, and really kind of begging for mercy, I think, in this time on our country, because it's a really sad time.
Thank you for that, and very good advice. Never underestimate the power of prayer, especially in this context. Before we wrap up for the evening, we have covered so much ground. This has been a fascinating discussion. I can't thank both of you enough for your time and for your expertise. One final question for both of you. What would you say, what would you tell Marylanders as we fill out our ballots, go to the polls this November? Why should we vote against question 1?
Because it's obvious.
Right.
You go, Elizabeth. Yeah.
I mean, I think we should vote against it because it doesn't meet the needs of women. I mean, I think, something Erika said about when I hear freedom, what I hear is this sort of, I can't remember exactly how you put it, but it's abandonment. Abortion is abandoning women and their children to some sort of like notion of autonomy or freedom, but it leaves them alone and abandoned. And the reasons women choose abortion are because they don't have support, or they have a lot of demands without support to meet those. Abortion doesn't respond to that. We need to, as a society, respond to the authentic needs of women and babies. And this amendment doesn't do it.
Yeah, and I guess I would add, I mean, I completely echo all of that. And I guess I would just add that last part about how, in our time, we really, I think, for the good of men, for the good of my sons, for the good of, I know the great good that our children have been for my own husband, that to call men to task, to call men to be fathers, to have higher expectations of men, to, take sex more seriously, all of those things, right now we have a structure. We basically created like a structure around abortion license, and it's a structure that then feeds all of our relationships, and all of our understandings around sex, around work, around parenting, around all of these different things. And it's like this band-aid that is put on something, and it's like right now kind of gushing, and we haven't dealt with any of the things underneath. And so we have all these people who I think are they don't have the kind of basic like goods, that having obligations, that someone has claims upon me, that I owe a vulnerable person something. What a good that is for me. Like, our grandparents understood this, even my parents, I come from divorce, a couple divorces, and even they understood that, like the obligations they had to me, and I just think like what that does, like we've always known that, so many throughout human history, like the wisest thing is like when people kind of care for others, how that brings great good out of them. And I think by like having abortion be there as kind of this privileged response to, to a difficult situation, a potentially, a fallen relationship, all these kinds of things, that we take that out, instead of really asking more of ourselves, all of us, and the community at large, but also the men involved, the women involved, the parents, the siblings, all of it. And how else are we going to see like a nation knit back together, if we're just, basically taking it out on the vulnerable? And I just think for the good of our nation that we have to think about what real freedom is. And freedom is for doing the good, carrying out our responsibilities to one another, and the duties we owe to the vulnerable.
Thank you both. Very well said. So I want to, as we wrap up this evening, before we go, we're going to put on screen a slide with where you can go to find out more information about question 1 here in Maryland. The Maryland Catholic Conference has put together an incredible plethora of resources for parishes, for individuals. Everything is completely bilingual, so it's available in English and Spanish. We hope that you will visit the website, learn more about the issue, and please, please, please do not forget to go out and vote this November, and also make sure that you keep this issue and the issue of life in general in your prayers as we go into November, but even past November. We have a lot ahead of us, some big mountains to climb when it comes to the issue of life here in this country. But I am hopeful, especially when we look at the conversation that we were able to have tonight. We have some amazing people working on this issue and fighting for life. So again, thank you both so much, Elizabeth, Kirk, and Erika Bachiochi. I can't thank you both enough for being here with us tonight and for lending us your expertise. It's been a wonderful conversation. I'm going to end us with a prayer. We'll end with a glory be. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you again to all of you for being with us this evening. I hope you were able to learn a great deal about question 1 and the issue of abortion and life in general. Again, please feel free to visit our website at Maryland Catholic Conference to get more information about this and many other issues.